the hard drive. But as soon as you take that data off the hard drive, it's no longer encrypted. Okay. EFS is a little different. It's always encrypted, no matter where you take it. So you can take it out of the original location it was in, and it's still not going to open up to anybody. Okay. Um, so that's really what EFS does. It's been around longer than things like BitLocker has been available, um, at least from Microsoft's offerings. But it does have some limitations, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Most of the limitations are organizations needing to have the infrastructure set up and working properly ahead of time. Okay. Okay, so the main requirement for EFS is an NTFS file system. So you can't do this on a FAT file system. So if you've got one of those removable USB sticks, if it's not formatted with NTFS, you're not going to be able to use EFS. Okay. Now, the major components of EFS file system is encrypting folders and files. You have to have certificates, so that's one of the reasons this is coming in here. So there's got to be a way that users can get certs, and there's got to be a method of recovering in the case of disaster. I'm going to put a little asterisk next to that one because often that's the sticking point. Okay. Okay, so let's just first let me just show you where you can kind of play. I'll go with CMIS 1014. So if I go into the properties of any particular folder, right? This is an NTFS file system. And so you're going to see some attributes, read-only, hidden. Those are like some classic attributes associated with files on a file system, okay? So these both exist going back to older versions of the FAT file system. But when they created NTFS, they brought those along with them. They also added some new ones, okay? So this is normally where we take care of security, right? But if you go into the Advanced tab, there's a section on encrypting contents to secure data, okay? So you can check that, and then what's going to happen, there's a process behind all of that. But effectively what's going to happen is that a new cert is going to be created for you, and this file, or this folder in this case, is going to be encrypted according to a symmetric key, and the symmetric key is going to be encrypted using your public key. Okay. And then your private key is needed if anybody wants to access that data in the future, because the only way to get to that symmetric key, which is used to encrypt all the data, is to decrypt it with your private key, and you're the only one who has it. That's the idea. Okay. So you just have to turn that on. I'm not going to actually turn it on, but then everything else happens in the background. Okay. You like the request for a cert, all of that is just it's either handled by the local system, or it's requested over the domain. Okay. Usually this is a local system thing. But the domain does come in a domain joined environment. That's where recovery becomes possible, and that requires a domain account. Okay. So a user decides they have important information that qualifies for encryption. They right-click the folder and choose encrypt, like I showed you. And then a pair of encryption keys are generated by Windows, a public and a private key, right? And we use this. This is done through certificate services, right? So when the file or folder is encrypted, a new attribute is created. It's a file system attribute, okay? So it's not actually changing the file itself. It's changing some metadata about the file on the file system, okay? Um, and this is the field that's created is something called the data decryption field, okay? So the public keys in the data decryption field, whenever someone attempts to access the file or folder, the public key requests the private key for decryption, okay? And so if you don't have that private key, if you're somebody else, you're out of luck, right? Only that user should be able to access it. If you are that user, it's still pretty invisible to you. You're not really, unless you're looking under the hood or behind the curtain, you're not really aware that you've got these keys, right? So the average user who's turning this on, they might just see it and think, oh yeah, I'd like to encrypt my stuff, but they don't necessarily understand what the consequences are. At the same time, you might have people who are a bit more enthusiastic about security, and they do kind of understand, but they may not understand it enough. Okay, so very bad things can happen when you allow, well, not when you allow, but when people start to use EFS. People pretty quickly learn that there are complications to it. Okay, so this is very much like the problem with ransomware, except that ransomware is intentional. Um, so, it's the same idea. If somebody kind of gets access to your environment, they start encrypting files with a public key, and then they're holding that private key for ransom. And they're saying, I'm not going to give it to you till you give me money, right? That's essentially what ransomware is. So i- EFS is very similar in terms of the process that gets used to encrypt the data. Okay. Now, EFS itself, this is not meant to be malicious, and so there is a recovery process built into it. Okay. However, that only works in a domain environment. So if a user, say, encrypts a file, and let's just say forget about quitting, let's say they get fired. Okay. So a lot of organizations, you get fired, you're escorted out of the building that day, you know? They don't usually give you like 2 weeks notice. So in that case, there's no time to clean up affairs. And um, what's going to happen is that you're not going to have access to that user's file, whatever it is that they encrypted. Okay. If you're in a work group, so if you're not part of a domain, there's no way to recover that information. Okay. And that's a little bit, that's not 100% accurate. There are ways to recover it. But, let's say the person was using their own laptop and working from home. Um, and so they did share, they stored a file somewhere, but you don't have access to their laptop. Then there's no recovery. If you have full access to their laptop, you can go in and you can get that private key. Okay. So it's not quite true that there's no recovery at all. You can do it if you have full access to the system that they encrypted on. Okay. In the domain, though, it's much easier. So once you set up recovery agents in a domain, basically what happens is that group policy dictates that every time someone turns on EFS, not just their key, but also another key that belongs to the recovery agent gets associated with that encrypted, folder or files. Okay. And that means that not only can the original encryptor's key decrypt everything, but so can the recovery agents. Okay. Now this is where it's a little more complicated than what's really being spelled out here. Let me just see. Yeah. So when they're saying a new attribute called a data decryption field is created and a public key is in the DDF, it is a little more, it's more two-step than that. Okay. It's not that it's storing it is storing the public key, but it's actually using the public key to encrypt that symmetric key that I talked about earlier. Okay. Now, when you actually set this up on a domain, you do that twice. Okay. So you're going to have there's going to be a recovery field essentially. Okay. A data recovery field. And that's going to have the public key of the recovery agent, and it's also going to have an encrypted version of that symmetric key using the public key of the recovery agent. So you'll have two of these fields. And although you can never really recover that top field, the first one, right? The data recovery field will allow you to get access to exactly the same symmetric key. Okay. And that's what makes it all function, really. Because there's no real way to gain access once you lose the private key of the original user. There's no way to get that field back, but you can still go to the data recovery field, okay? Because group policy is dictated. You're going to add this field every time that somebody sets up encryption, okay? So this is how recovery can work. if you don't set this up, like if you don't set it up in group policy, then you're in the same boat as you would be if you were in a work group. Okay. So that's one of the main problems that happens is that in an organization, the centralized techs, maybe they're not thinking about using EFS. And then the fact of the matter is some Yahoo in the organization can just decide to turn it on anyways, right? And since there's no data recovery enabled in the environment, if they make a mistake and they lose access to their key, they're out of luck. And that's when there's a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth and things like that. Okay. So people do learn, but only through hard experience, that EFS is not, you've really got to have it prepared ahead of time. I know at Nate, the techs here, they're just simply, no, we don't support EFS. Okay. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I would say just set up a darn recovery agent. But I think, maybe they didn't quite understand it. I'm not too sure. But, basically, anytime somebody encrypts something and they bump into a problem, they're like, you're on your own. Okay. So the recovery field, how is this added? The public key that's required for data recovery is added by group policy, and it's automatically written to every file and folder on the domain once you enable this policy. So anything that was done earlier, it's too late, right? You can't add it in because you don't um, you don't know what that original symmetric key was. Okay, so but anything subsequently, there will be the ability to recover. So this is one of those things where it's not a bad idea just to set it up early on, and then if you never need it, that's fine. And if you do need it, it's there. So the domain administrator typically is the one who has the master key that can be used to decrypt any file encrypted by EFS. By domain administrator, I actually mean the administrator account, which nobody typically logs in with. Okay. We all usually use our own domain admin accounts, which are, named after us in some way, right? And this other one is just kind of kept off to the side, just in case. All right. And so again, for the master key, it's there just in case. Okay. Now, setting up an EFS recovery agent means that you actually have to allow for the publishing and the enrollment of a recovery agent. You want to be careful about who you give access to this for. Okay, so not everybody should be able to enroll to get a recovery agent, right? A recovery agent certificate. This is something that the domain administrator should be able to do. Okay. So it is typically assigned to the domain admin. You create your own template for EFS recovery agent. You publish it out, and then you can deploy it to your domain, and you can request a certificate as domain admin. So you can either do that manually, or you can configure it through group policy, and either of those is going to work. Okay. Now, you don't need to create the key through group policy. You could do that manually, but you do have to use group policy to actually arrange for all EFS encryption to start using that key, right? So once you've configured the certificate, you're going to see it in the computer configuration, Windows settings, public key policies, encrypting file system. That's where it's going to show up, okay? Or where you add it. So this means that all the computers on the domain, they're going to have that recovery key installed on the machine. Um, however, I will say they're not actually the private key is not going to be published in group policy. Okay, because that's something that you shouldn't share, right? When you set up a group policy has to be readable, and you got to be careful about what you're letting people see. And so typically, what's going to be made available is the public key of the certificate, right? But the private key is not going to be shared with anybody. And so that means that that key could be used to create a data recovery field. But when you actually have to recover, it's not going to help you that much. You need to get the private key from the original cert by exporting it out. Okay. So it's not just like automagical. You actually have to think about it a little bit just think, you have to be a little paranoid about not sharing that private key. And so it's not as easy as, oh, it's up on Active Directory. You got to go and fetch it. Okay. So setting up EFS, I already kind of talked about this here. You create a folder on the desktop, let's say, right-click Properties Advanced, and then you just kind of check that puppy off there. And then the file should have a lock symbol on it. It's maybe a little hard to see here, but there's just like a little golden lock. That indicates that it's encrypted. Okay. Now, setting up, let me just see, what is this? Every sticker. Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay. So setting up EFS, you go into the properties of the document and you go into advanced details, and you're able to see who it is who encrypted the file, right? And what their certificate thumbprint is. So if you're looking to try and locate the original owner and the original certificate that they were using, this is where you can actually go and do that. Okay. Sometimes that makes more sense than having to dig out the private key of the domain administrator and make it available on a certain machine and then decrypt everything. It may be as easy as just figuring out who the heck encrypted it and what certificate they were using and seeing if you can locate it, you know? Now, one warning I'll give you about EFS is Windows shares. Okay, some people, they're enthusiastic about encryption. They turn it on, and then they create an encrypted folder up on a share somewhere. When they do that, it's their machine which is going to actually create a certificate for them, right? And so if they're roaming around on different machines, they may not even know where it was that they actually set this up, right? And that means they can lock themselves out of their own data. Another thing is, if you take a file, you move it into an encrypted like an encrypted folder, that'll encrypt it. If you move it out of the encrypted folder, it's going to stay encrypted. Okay. So that means if you take it off-site, it's still an encrypted file, and you're still going to need that key to open it up. And these are things that people aren't prepared for necessarily, right? So somebody might, set up an encrypted, EFS up on a share, and they're just thinking, oh, so nobody else can access it. And then they're going to move data onto a USB stick. They're going to take it home, and they find that they just can't access their data from there, right? There's all sorts of little complications that people don't really think about. Now let's say we can see here, in this case, the file is locked to the user who encrypted it, but it is accessible by recovery. Okay, so a recovery agent can still come around, and that's the administrator in this case. Okay, um, so even if you're locked out, you've got this other option. Okay, and that's what we're going to work on in this exercise coming up here. Best practice for users, if you encrypt a file, it's best practice to back up your encryption keys. Most users don't even know that they have encryption keys, honestly. Okay. But it is a good idea to back it up. However, you have to back it up somewhere secure. And so that becomes another problem you have to deal with. Okay. You don't want to keep it in the same place as your files, obviously. So just consider you encrypted a file on a file share. You then have a catastrophic hardware failure, so your host goes down. Then that encryption key is gone, right? Unless you took a backup of it. And so that means that anything that was up on the share is also gone. The thing that I've seen that causes people to freak out is if you go through an upgrade process on your operating system or a replacement of your physical hardware. Typically, you'll lose all your encryption keys on the system, right? And so people who have set up encryption, maybe it's worked for them for quite some time, all of a sudden they're locked out of their system, and the the old original system is not available anymore. Okay, so exporting the certificate and backing it up somewhere is a wise thing to do. You can just click on backup keys there and then just export it, right? Okay, so the one thing I want you to really keep in mind is that the private key is not going to be available over the domain. Okay, so while you're going through this exercise or this assignment in this case, do keep in mind that the fact that we're setting up a recovery agent doesn't mean that we're just going to be able to restore everything very simply and automatically. It's still a bit of a manual process. Okay. And that's just because of the security that needs to be involved in protecting that key. So this should be, uh, yeah, okay. Should be available now. And I think I already got it. I already have it opened up here. Any questions before I move into the exercise or assignment? I just take an extra long time because I know people take a while to type sometimes. Okay. So the goal here is for you to set up EFS infrastructure, set up a folder structure with a couple of accounts, enable encryption for each of those users, and use a data recovery aid, like basically lock them out of some files and use a data recovery agent to show that it can still get in. Okay. So this is worth 10%. There's 10 marks through the whole thing. You just have to take some screenshots. And you could just embed it directly in this document. Okay. So you could just submit this document with replaced images and I'll correct it that way. Okay. So there's a there's a bit of a caveat here I just want to mention. So this was built by Kent, and he kind of said, if you want to complete this exercise, you'll need new VMs to get this to work. So you have to build a brand new infrastructure. I don't think that's actually necessary. Okay, so I've kind of left it in there because I'm a little paranoid about why he thinks that's necessary. So I'm leaving it in there as, you might have to do this. Okay, but I don't really think that you do have to do it. I'm just going to say might. Okay, I'm pretty sure, like 80%, I'm going to say. Probably more than that, because in other terms, I do believe people didn't have to rebuild anything. So I'm like 95% sure, maybe, or maybe 90, that you're not going to have to rebuild stuff. You could probably just take the old stuff that you have, so long as it's functioning well. Okay. If it's not functioning well, then you could build a brand new infrastructure, not a two-tier, he's saying. He said just use an enterprise. I don't think that's necessary. I think you can work with what you have. Okay? What you will need, though, is an enterprise CA of some type. You're going to need your domain controller, and you're going to need a Windows 10 client joined to the domain. Okay, so I mean, I would say try it out first time with the infrastructure you have right now. Create a couple of users, Bert and Ernie. Okay, create this folder structure. So you've just got at the root of C, there's DMIT 2515 data 1, and under that you've got the folders data F2, data F1, and temp. Okay, and you can just stick with the defaults in terms of rights. Okay. Now within that structure, within that hierarchy, we're gonna enable some EFS, but only after we set up the group policy, right? So you do that, you set up some group policy there, release a new recovery agent key, okay, as well as allowing users to have basic EFS so they can get their own keys. Um, da, 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 da. Basically prove that the user's got some keys. Set up your recovery agent. Make sure that it's your domain administrator. Okay. And then we start encrypting stuff. Okay. And what we're going to do is lock out Bert and Ernie from their own certain files. They just won't have access because they're dumping things into areas that one of them has encrypted versus the other, etc. It creates a whole schlemazel, and then only the recovery agent can really kind of wade through it all and get everything back. Okay. So at the end of it, you want to show that you could actually get into the data that we've been locked out of and indicate that, you are the domain administrator. Okay. So that's worth a couple of marks, so 20% of the total. Uh, Typically, the biggest issue that people have, I find, is just forgetting uh, that the fact that there's um, a published certificate in Active Directory for the domain administrator doesn't mean that the private key is included in it. You still have to export that and do something with it. So when people bump into a problem, that's usually what it is here. So they won't be able to access the content. They think they've got the cert, but they only have the part of it that includes the public key. So just watch out for that. Otherwise, this is pretty paint by numbers. Okay, I don't think you're going to have any problems with it. Any questions about that? Okay. Any questions about other stuff? I know that there were some people who said they had lingering questions about certain things, like secure apps or something like that. Okay. Um, so I'll let people go. Anybody who wants to individually ask questions, feel free to let me know. Right? You want to bother me about mail server? Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Yeah, like I'm open for business here, basically. So it doesn't really matter what the topic is. Um, what else did I want to say? Oh, yeah. The certificates quiz. I'm looking to get that back to you today. So you should get it at some point in the day. I'm not sure when exactly. Uh, but I've got enough time that I should be able to finish correcting it and publishing it out to everybody. Okay, so you expect that to be coming down the pipe. Okay, have yourselves a good morning, and I'll see you next time.